Good to have you with us. It is clearly Friday.
Woo.
I'm Joe Fryer.
And I'm Savannah Sires. We're going to begin our show this morning with the ongoing concerns over President Biden's candidacy for re-election following yesterday's closely watched news conference at the NATO summit in Washington.
He provided detailed answers to several policy questions, but the president also made a couple of verbal gaffes yesterday that allowed questions about his fitness to serve to persist. In one moment, the president mistakenly called his vice president Trump instead of Harris. And during an event before the conference, Mr. Biden incorrectly introduced Ukrainian President Zelensky as Russian President Putin, which he immediately corrected. The stumbles appear to have put more pressure on President Biden, with at least 3 more House Democrats calling on him to step aside. It's worth noting former President Trump has also conflated names on the campaign trail this year, including mixing up President Biden with former President Obama. Now, despite these concerns about Mr. Biden, the president struck a defiant tone yesterday, saying he is still the right person for the job.
I've got to finish this job because there's so much at stake. I believe I'm the best qualified to govern, and I think I'm the best qualified to win. But there are other people who could beat Trump too. But it's awful start from scratch. And, you know, we talk about, you know, money raised. We're not doing bad. We got about $220 million in the bank. We're doing well.
We've got a team standing by to talk more about all this and the state of the race. We're going to start things off with NBC News White House correspondent Ali Raffa. Ali, the stakes probably could not have been higher. Walk us through some of the key moments from the president's news conference yesterday. I mean, was this the kind of performance the White House hopes will calm some of the fears surrounding Mr. Biden's candidacy?
Yeah, guys, good morning. Well, the White House was certainly hoping so. And the big question going into last night was really whether this would move the conversation, whether this would move the needle at all in the right direction for the Biden team. And you have to think the bar was set so incredibly high that the thinking was, you know, the president could hit it out of the park and there would still be those doubters, those nervous Democrats calling for him to step aside. And there were real fears at the beginning of this press conference that it would go south because of what you mentioned with the president confusing Ukrainian President Zelensky with Russian President Putin shortly before this press conference even started. And then shortly after it started, he flubbed the name of his own vice president. Listen to that part here.
I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president. So let's start there. Number one, the fact is that the consideration is that I think I'm the most qualified person to run for president. I beat him once, and I will beat him again.
Some other highlights from that press conference last night. The president said that he would be willing to take a neurological exam if his doctor suggested it, but he said that none of them have, but saying that even if he did, that no one would be satisfied. He also said that he's not in the 2024 race for his own legacy. He says, I'm in this to complete the job I started. But the consensus after this almost hour-long press conference was that essentially, once again, the president has bought himself more time, similar to what he did with the ABC News interview and those campaign trail swings throughout last week. And that's just not what some Democrats want to hear, considering that every day the president remains in this race is a day that those nervous Democrats lose in being able to find a viable backup option, you guys.
Although the Biden campaign is trying to strike this optimistic tone publicly, we are hearing different things happening behind the scenes. What is NBC News learning here?
Yeah, the Biden campaign is saying that the president did a great job at proving his doubters wrong last night. But privately, it's a different story. We know that several of President Biden's closest allies, including 3 people directly involved in his reelection effort, are telling NBC that they see his chances at being reelected as 0, and that his candidacy and his remaining in this race is endangering the political futures of Democrats down the ballot. They said, quote, he needs to drop out from one campaign officials. They said he will never recover from this. Another person saying, quote, no one involved in the effort thinks he has a path. And of course, all of this is coming as the campaign continues to try to ease the fears of these nervous Democrats. We know several senior Biden campaign advisors were on Capitol Hill yesterday meeting with Senate Democrats, proving to them that there is a path to victory at the end of all of this. And several senators came out of that meeting saying they were not convinced, you guys.
I mean, we do understand the Biden campaign has started to quietly assess the viability of Vice President Harris as a possible replacement candidate. What more can you tell us about that? Are there people who think that she does have a better chance than the current president?
Yeah, we learned yesterday that the Biden team is quietly assessing her viability in a head-to-head matchup against former President Trump, but it's not exactly clear the reason for this. One source familiar says that it could be because they know that the Trump team is preparing to seize on this opportunity and really ramp up its attacks against Vice President Harris. And we've already seen that happen last week during a rally that he held in Florida. And the other set of thinking is that this would be able to really convince the president in these head-to-head matchups, whether the vice president polls better, potentially worse, or even the same as him in these head-to-head matchups. And we know that there's a very small circle of people around him right now really backing up his decision to stay in the race. So whether what impact those polls have on that conversation is going to be something to watch, you guys.
All right, Ali Rafa, appreciate your reporting. Thank you.
Now let's head over to our other favorite, Ali, NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Vitale, for more on the reactions from Congress. Ali, good morning. So we heard from plenty of lawmakers in the moments following this lengthy press conference from the president. Tennessee Congressman Steve Cohen was one of the few who felt Mr. Biden solidified his candidacy. Let's first listen to that.
I think he convinced a lot of people he should stay in the race. I haven't heard anybody speak so much and so well and so knowledgeably about foreign policy since maybe, I don't know, back in the World Dean Rusk. I mean, he knows his stuff, and that's one of the main jobs of the president is foreign policy, and there's nobody could be better.
So put those comments in context for us. Are most Democrats sharing those views?
Not really. And there's definitely not a consensus here, Savannah. And for those who might not know who Dean Rusk is, because it's a pretty obscure reference from the congressman, it's a former Secretary of State from the Kennedy and then LBJ administrations. Again, if you're trying to make the point, I think that Democrats really have to find a way to make the point here. But look, in my conversations yesterday, even when we started the day together, I had been told by lawmakers there will be more of my colleagues coming out and saying the president should step down. Certainly that rang true as we saw more Democrats added to the list of total House Democrats that we've seen telling the president that he should step aside. You're showing polling on the screen there that shows a plurality of voters, Democratic voters, who feel the same way after that debate. But the fact is, press conferences like this one, it's sort of a mixed bag in terms of what electeds are saying and what our sources are saying in terms of the fact that, yes, there were some mistakes, but there was also a clear command of complex issues like foreign policy. Biden had flares of moments where he talked about gun violence as a scourge in this country. Certainly, that's the kind of messaging that Democrats want to see. And I have to tell you, they are so desperate to see it because there is not one person in the Democratic ranks that I have spoken to who hasn't said some version of, I love Joe Biden, but I have concerns about electability. I have concerns about his ability to carry the message. Each moment that the president has now is going to be under a microscope, and you can't keep living in this space. And Congressman Jim Himes, when he came out last night and said he thinks the president should step aside, this is a point that he made. You can't jump from presidential event to presidential event and make each one this inflection point, this precipice of a moment that the president has to prove himself. You can't keep having Democrats try to grade the president on a curve, and that's why this has become such a protracted battle. And frankly, I've asked lawmakers, guys, how much longer can you do this without utterly hobbling your nominee, who is Joe Biden at this point? And none of them have an answer. It's this continuous timeline of fretting with no end in sight. That's not good for anybody.
Ali, let's talk a little bit about what happened in the Senate yesterday. 3 top Biden advisors met with Senate Democrats for just under 2 hours, outlining what they believe is his path to victory in November. What else are you learning about that meeting?
Well, look, senators came out of that meeting and said they were asked not to talk about it. But you and we all know if it went well, senators would have been out there crowing about it, and no one would have had any qualms with the fact that those leaks were happening. Instead, what we did end up hearing from senators in a limited capacity was that this was a heated exchange where multiple senators either came out and said that they didn't feel that they were any more reassured. Some came out and said that they did feel good, but many of those were the ones that went in saying that they supported the president. There were heated exchanges, according to our sources, over the path to victory, really trying to get these advisors, these top advisors to the Biden campaign, to show them how this works. I think it's important for us to say a lot of these Democrats really want to hear this. They would like to feel reassured in the fact that Biden is the nominee. And I think they came out of that Senate meeting not necessarily hearing that. And so, again, we go into a moment where physically lawmakers are no longer on the Hill. They're on recess for another week, but that just drags us out for another week potentially. And there's an open debate on whether or not it's better to have lawmakers in the Capitol making these declarations. Are they more likely to make it when they get home? All of that, I've heard different sides of the coin from different people. But this is just going to continue on in this similar fashion until someone in leadership says, all right, we've done enough. Let's cut it out.
Ali Vitale, great reporting. Thank you very much.
Let's talk about the Trump campaign now. We're joined by NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard. So I'm being asked a lot of questions right now about Project 2025. It's this very conservative plan for a second Trump White House term. Trump is distancing himself from it. He says he doesn't know who's behind it, but there are connections to people who know him well. Tell us more about your report.
Right. Project 2025, excuse me, Project 2025 is a more than 900-page policy roadmap that would be able to be turned over and handed over to a second Trump administration, essentially to enact policies and add on personnel from every department and agency. It also has the reality that some of the key authors of this project are individuals who were former advisors and aides to him inside of the White House. And Donald Trump, in fact, in 2022, at a Heritage Foundation dinner, he made the clear statement that this was the group that was going to be laying out the groundwork for what a second Trump administration would look like in their plans. And one of the authors of Project 2025 is also an author of the official GOP platform that is going to be voted on next week here at the Milwaukee Republican National Convention. So for Donald Trump, a great number of these folks, including like Ben Carson, his former secretary in his cabinet, he was another one of these authors here. But this is a policy book that some of the policies, like on abortion, Donald Trump is understanding of are not necessarily popular with the majority of Americans. And he has an election to win 4 months from now. But the folks that are behind this, there's more than 100 conservative groups. And for them, they see this as a great basis for a launching pad for the Trump administration come January 2025.
Also, let's ask you about one piece of news from yesterday. The former president met with the prime minister of Hungary at Mar-a-Lago. Why did that happen, and what are the takeaways?
Victor Orban is a unique figure in terms of being a NATO member ally. He is somebody who has promoted the idea of a liberal democracy, has urged the cutting off of financial aid to Ukraine, has resisted the expansion of NATO to add on additional members. Donald Trump has called him the boss and has said that he is the smartest leader that he knows. This is the second trip to Mar-a-Lago that Victor Orban has made. And of course, Donald Trump has openly questioned whether the U.S. should send continued financial aid to Ukraine. The two men did meet at Mar-a-Lago yesterday. Of course, this was happening parallel to the NATO meetings that President Biden was a part of in Washington, D.C. But if there were to be a second Trump administration, Orban is somebody who concerns many who are opposed to Donald Trump because of the way that he has used greater executive power in Hungary during his term as prime minister here. And Donald Trump has said and acknowledged that if Victor Orban says something in his country, it gets done. Many people have fears that Donald Trump would try to use the White House in a similar manner that Victor Orban has in Hungary.
All right, Vaughn, thank you so much. Appreciate your reporting.
Well, this morning, the dangerous heat wave roasting parts of the U.S. is getting worse. The record temperatures now being blamed for nearly 40 heat-related deaths across the country. Out west, it's so hot. You can see here some people in Arizona are cooking their breakfast outside. And in Texas, where 1 million people who were in the path of Hurricane Beryl, they still don't have power. So some residents are choosing to sleep in their cars just to get air conditioning. NBC News correspondent Emily Aketa is on New York's Coney Island, where triple-digit heat is expected next week.
Hey there. Well, the heat we're expecting is the kind where officials are urging people to drink water every 15 minutes when they're outside, and it's not expected to ebb. In fact, those high temperatures are expected to continue to spread in the coming days. For the more than 1 million Americans that are waking up without power, without AC this morning, the situation is turning dire. Across the country, there are nearly 40 deaths blamed on the heat. Out west on social media, you're seeing people demonstrating it's so hot that they can actually cook their breakfast outside. In Texas, hundreds of thousands of people are expected to remain without power as a result of the remnants of Hurricane Beryl for another several days. They've already been dealing with those heats, and the hospital systems down there have been reporting a surge in heat-related illnesses. So there's pressure mounting on the power company's Centerpoint there, but it points out that while it understands the difficulty and the frustrations from residents, it has restored power to 1 million customers faster than it ever has. In the Northeast, a bit of a different problem. The remnants of Hurricane Beryl bringing an immense amount of rain over the last couple of days and some reported tornadoes. In Vermont, for instance, the National Guard even activated, helping with more than 100 water rescues. This comes exactly a year after it saw similar catastrophic flooding. Back here along New York City beaches, some have been reopened after NYPD drones spotted at least 2 sharks swimming near shore. If it's not the sharks, it's the rip currents they're warning people about. Always remember to swim near a lifeguard. And when you see those yellow and red flags, be mindful of potentially life-threatening conditions. Back to you.
Good advice, Emily. Thank you.
Now, despite record-setting heat in other parts of the country, on the East Coast, heavy rain expected heading into the weekend. For more, let's check on your Morning News Now forecast.
Angie Lastman is in studio with us this Friday. Hey, Angie, good morning.
Good morning, guys. Don't worry. We'll get to the heat. We can't avoid talking about that. But we've also got some rain that we're tracking this morning that could impact that early morning drive, and it could impact your weekend plans across parts of the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast. Here's what we've got. Just some of these showers that are continuing to work their way a little farther inland. We've got Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Richmond, stretching down to Charlotte, dealing with some rain early this morning. And the flood alerts are up because of this. And we're not just going to see one day of some of this rain. This area could see multiple repeated rounds of some slow-moving storms over the next couple of days. So 18 million people included in these flood alerts. We do have a couple of flash flood warnings stretching across this area. We'll likely see more of those here as the weekend goes on. But here's why. This stationary front is stuck. It's just hanging out. It's going to kind of meander in this general area here as we get through the weekend. And that means that these slow-moving downpours, they're still in the picture, not just today, into tomorrow too, although a big batch of that moisture will move offshore and we'll see some more dry time. But still, a couple of these scattered showers will be in the picture, and that flooding will stay with us as well. There's the heat. As promised, we've got 42 million people under these heat alerts. You'll notice, as mentioned, we still have some of those heat alerts up in parts of Texas with all those folks dealing with power outages still, and the temperatures well above normal for this time of year. And out west, really west of the Rockies, and even a couple of points east of the Rockies, we're dealing with these heat alerts. And this isn't going to change anytime soon. We're kind of stuck in this pattern. So let's start with the heat and humidity that we're going to see across parts of the Southeast. 101 for Dallas today for what it feels like 97 in Houston. We've got the high 90s in the low 100s across this region. Tallahassee ends up at 101. New Orleans feels like 106. So it's going to be brutal when it comes to the heat and humidity. But out west, of course, it's not the humidity, but it's just the heat that's brutal. Palm Springs, 112. Las Vegas, 112 today. Phoenix, same story there. We've got Denver at 100 degrees. We usually only see a couple of 100-degree days in Denver per year. We've seen multiple in a row at this point, and we're going to continue to see that heat stick around at least over the weekend and into early next week for a good chunk of the country. Notice Nashville, 100 degrees both Monday and Tuesday for the actual temperatures. We've got 97 in Omaha on Monday, 102 on Monday in Wichita. So this goes well into early next week. So we'll be watching for more of these records, especially out west, to continue to be broken. Here's a look at your Saturday across the country. A couple of severe storms possible in the upper Midwest, the soggy conditions for the East Coast. A little sunshine, though, for the middle of the country by Sunday. The heat is going to be the big story, guys, but we will have a couple of spots dealing with rain across the Southeast and the Great Lakes.
Right. Looks like a summer forecast right there.
Yeah,
Thank you, Angie.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Angie.
it.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.